So, you've been looking for a weapon set to main and where wins meet, but don't know where to start. Well, I've got just the video for you. Whether you want to be a pure DPS, a devastating tank, support healer, or anything else in between, we've got many options from the 12 weapons, or better yet, martial arts, coming out with the global launch. Keep in mind that while some of these weapons have great synergies with one another, you're still absolutely free to come up with your own combinations and playstyle. Also, quick disclaimer before we proceed, it's good to know that fully maxing out the whole weapon set will be quite costly in terms of time and resources. That is why I highly recommend trying them all out, especially during the leveling stage, during which you don't have to invest much, yet still feel powerful with all of them. That being said, let's get started with the Nameless Sword and the Nameless Spear. I'm covering both together because you pretty much get them from very early on and they also synergize very well with one another. And together they provide a playstyle that's very high on mobility, has very good DPS, decent survivability as well via Chi Shield and some of the stuns that the Spear provides. And it's also not too difficult to master even for new players. Plus, it has a crazy heavy charge attack via the Spear called Storm Dance that I absolutely love with the combo I'm going to show you in just a little bit. But in terms of the sword skills, both the light and the regular heavy attacks are pretty straightforward. They are both made out of a series of 4 hits that for the most part deal some pretty respectable damage. However, what's interesting about this weapon is its charged heavy skill. So if you hold down the heavy attack button, your character will instead unleash a sword energy wave towards the target. And the longer you keep that button pressed, the higher the damage and the range will be on that projectile. Besides that, we also got the martial arts called Fearless Lunge. With this, your character throws its weapon towards the targets and then proceeds to quickly dash towards it. You can pretty much follow this up with 2 more button presses, which will deal increasingly higher damage, with the final one also providing a Chi Shield that by default lasts for 3 seconds. And this shield provides complete immunity to incoming Chi damage. So not only is this great as a gap closing ability, but there's actually a strong synergy between this, the charged projectile, and also the sword morph internal art early on. So if you're still under the effect of the Chi Shield and then charge up a heavy attack, you're going to unleash 3 projectiles or energy waves instead of just 1, massively increasing your DPS from very early on. Finally, we've also got a special skill called Shadow Step, which by default, if you only press it once, you do a leap backwards and then unleash an energy wave, and if you follow up with another button press within 3 seconds, you get to sword dash towards the target once again. But if you just press it once, it actually provides a very good way of disengaging and then unleashing that energy wave with the charged heavy. Now, in terms of the Nameless Spear, it follows a similar button structure to that of the Nameless Sword, hence why it's coupling so well with it. But specifically, both the light and the regular heavy attacks are made out of 4 and 3 attack combos respectively, primarily cross slashes and stabs. But more important, on the heavy attack, the third and final hit in the chain is pretty decent at interrupting enemy attacks, so you can use that quite reliably even against the mini bosses. However, most interesting is the heavy charge attack on the weapon called Storm Dance. So with this, your character starts spinning its spear with increasingly high speeds, and as you can see, both the damage and the partial damage are absolutely insane. Plus, during that whole duration, you're completely immune to any ranged attacks. So this is also very good at protecting yourself against any bowmen or archers. Our martial arts skill is called the Kian Kun Lock, but I kinda call it the Quantum Lock. It's basically a 2-second stun that also gives 30 endurance upon usage and gives some endurance consumption reduction for about 5 seconds. So really good coupling with that charged Storm Dance ability. And finally, we have the special skill called Legion Crusher. This is just going to be a spear forward thrust attack that lets you enter unrivaled state, and this is going to couple really well with the Storm Dance, because if you are in unrivaled state, you can then unleash the Storm Spin much quicker. So in essence, you're going to want to start with Quantum Lock plus Legion Crusher, or the other way around. This is going to give you the unrivaled state, the stun, as well as endurance, and then you can follow up with the Storm Dance to absolutely shred the target to pieces. Early on, I really like the combination between these two because you can start with the Nameless Sword, go with the martial arts skill as a gap closer and to generate that Chi Shield, disengage with its special attack and then immediately unleash a 3-wave energy attack with the charge skill, then completely change directly to the Spear, which can follow up with the stun and the thrust, following up and finishing it off with the Storm Dance, which is absolutely going to shred the enemy. Like I said before, by this stage, if it's not dead, at the very least, it is going to be close to a stun state, so you can follow up with a quick finisher. So absolutely lovely to play with. That is why even in the end game, this is still going to remain a very strong combo to play with. But moving on to the next set, we have Strategic Sword with Heaven's Quaker Spear. However, as you're going to see in just a little bit, you don't have to combine them like the way it intends you to do. You can even break the sets and go with a completely different combo. I'm going to show you in just a little bit a combination between different weapons that still work very well. But starting with this setup, this provides lots of bleeds. This is your damage over time setup. However, this also has some very high burst because we can detonate all of those bleeds at one time. It has some decent mobility, but not quite as much as the previous. The survivability is lower. However, it will make you feel like you're playing Devil May Cry. And you also get lots of AoE and also a lot of damage buffs too if you go with the spear combo. Now, in terms of the Strategic Sword attacks, both the light and the regular heavy attacks are pretty similar to that of the Nameless Sword, and for good reason. They both pretty much use the same gear piece, but what's different is going to be the heavy charged attack. So this is going to be called the second track slash. With this, your character charges up an attack, dashes forward, going pretty much immune for the whole travel duration, followed by applying a series of bleed hits onto the target. So the more you hit them with that, the higher the number of stacks will be. Then we also have the martial arts skill called Inner Track Slash. This is going to be a series of spins that further slash the target and apply more bleed stacks. And finally, we've got the special skill, Inner Balance Strike 3. This is going to be a leap backwards followed by a detonation ability that consumes all of the bleed stacks but deals very high damage and staggered damage against that target, and then reapplies a couple of extra bleeds back to the target. So in essence, this is going to be a high damage over time sort of build, but one that also has high bursts of damage because we can detonate them via the special skill ability. And because it's so easy to follow up with a charge attack, we can reapply some extra bleed stacks, so the typical 2 bleed we get from the special ability will go with up to 5 with the ones that we get from the heavy charge attack. So we can back to back detonate 2 rows of 5 bleed stacks, one after the other. Now, in terms of the Heaven's Quake Spear, just like in the case of the Nameless one, both the light and the regular heavy attacks feature exactly the same move styles and combos. What's different is that on one side, the charge skill is called Drifting Thrust. So this is going to also be a charged ability that consumes endurance. However, this unleashes a flurry of thrusts into the target with the spear that deal really good damage and also gets them at least interrupted for that duration. But at the same time, also grants Fortitude, which gives you complete immunity to crowd control. So not only is this going to work really well with Heaven's Quaker, but also with the Mo Blade, as you're going to see a combo in just a little bit. Next, we have the martial arts skill, which is called Sober Sorrow. This is going to be a series of counterclockwise spins, and the more enemies or, well, more hits you get in, the higher the damage buff provided will be by this ability. So if you only got less than 5 hits in, that's going to give you Droplet or a 10% damage increase. Tier 2 is 5 to 10 hits, gives you Spring Surge for 15%, or if you got 10 or more hits, that gives you the 3rd tier River Flow for 20% damage increase, which is going to be quite a lot. But this synergizes really well with the special ability called Sweep All. This is also going to be a series of spins, this time around clockwise, and depending on the tier of the damage buff you got from the previous martial arts skill, it's going to get increasingly higher damage effects, even a bleed at the end of it. So if you only got the Droplet or 1st tier, that's going to only give it that 10% increase, 15% for the 2nd. However, if you got the full River Flow or full 10 hits with the previous skill, now you get to apply both the 20% damage increase and a stacking bleeding debuff on every enemy affected. And this is why I said you're not forced to go with the combinations that the game offers you. You can break the combos and go with your own playstyle. For example, one that I really enjoyed was the Heaven's Quaker Spear with the Mo Blade, which makes it so easy to apply that damage flowing river buff and get a ton of bleed stacks going AoE style. So in this case, I can start with the Mo Blade, draw as many targets I can in with its special ability, swap to the Spear, which lets me now apply a very easy 10+ hit since everybody's grouped up. So now that I got the buff, it's very easy to then perform its special ability and now get all the bleed stacks on every single affected target, not just the damage buff. So this gives me a very nice sort of tank slash DPS damage dealer combo, at least in the leveling stage. But like I said, you're absolutely free to go with your own combos and playstyles. But speaking of being a tank, totally can be that in Where Winds Meet, and there's actually a very strong setup between Thundercry Blade and the Stormbreaker Spear this time around. I'm gonna cover both of them, but if you want very high survivability, insane stagger potential, solid single hit damage at the cost of low mobility, you pretty much get these two right here to help you with it. And we're gonna start with the Thundercry Blade, aka the Mo Blade. In this case, this is going to be a heavy hitter, and there are some interesting things about it. Both the light and the heavy attacks are actually really slow and deliberate, and they do a pretty solid job at flattening the target, especially the light attack on the final 4th hit will flatten most of the targets. Meanwhile, the heavy one has a lot of uppercut slashes that also do a great job at interrupting enemies every now and then. However, both of them also feature charged versions, and they have some key differences you should keep in mind of. So if you hold down the respective buttons, for example, the charged light attack is better at hitting multiple targets and not having to worry about missing your attacks, but at the cost of lower damage and lower posture damage. Meanwhile, if you perform a heavy charged attack instead, that's going to be more single target unless you really group up enemies in a straight line. It's also easier to miss, but the damage both to HP and to the stagger meter are much higher. Like, I was able to reach 10,000 or close to that damage even with early on level builds. And did I mention that you can also move during the charge up? You totally can on both skills, which I highly recommend repositioning and getting a better angle to hit as many targets as you possibly can. Now, in terms of the martial arts skill, we have the Predator Shield. You can spam this relatively well. Gives you a shield that's equating to 25% of your HP for 8 seconds. Gives you some fighting spirit, which is basically your resource with this weapon that you can consume for special abilities. And there's also another version of the shield if you first have the drum beat effect from the spear we're gonna cover in just a little bit. That gives you an even better damage buff and an even better synergy, but we're gonna cover that via the spear in just a little bit. Meanwhile, for our special skill, we have the Sunrush Gale. Essentially, it's going to be a black hole of sorts. You draw all enemies in a pretty large radius, which you then follow up with a cross slash that typically flattens everybody out, and you even gain fortitude out of this, basically crowd control immunity. So the typical setup in this case would be starting up with a shield, which gives you the protection that you need. You go in and perform the special attack to draw all the targets in. This is also going to flatten them out most of the time. And for 5 seconds after this, all of your charge attacks are also 50% quicker. So you can follow up with a light charge or a heavy charge, whichever of these you want, to absolutely destroy all of these targets that get affected. Absolutely very devastating and fun to play with as a playstyle, especially for an Elden Ring type of player like myself. However, this brings us to the next spear, which couples really well with this, and that's going to be the Stormbreaker. So this is going to have some pretty interesting effects for itself. In terms of attacks, once again, they seem to be rather similar to that of the previous spears, with some key differences. One is that your charged attack with this one is going to be another series of, well, basically flurry of thrusts, much quicker than that of the Heaven's Breaker Spear, but with the added effect that this is now going to give you a drum beat buff. So this is pretty useful, gives a 15% damage increase to skill charge attacks and gives us some crowd control immunity. However, we can essentially double this when combined with the shield from the Mo Blade. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I were to just use the shield on its own, it only gives me the shield. Similarly, if I only were to use the heavy charge attack on the spear, I only get the 15% damage buff. However, if I start with the spear charge attack and get the drum beat effect on and then quickly switch to the Mo Blade, now you will see that my Q or the shield attack gets empowered. So if I press it while still under the effect of the drum beat, I get a stronger version of it that now also provides a 30% charged skill damage buff instead of just 15%. So as you probably realize, this is going to provide a perfect synergy with one another to unleash the highest possible amount of damage and really get those high damage numbers up against the targets. It's one of my preferred ways of playing, but there are other things that the spear can also do for you. So one of that is going to be the martial arts skill called Storm Roar. This is essentially a taunt. Yes, one of the few taunt mechanics in this game. However, this also debuffs enemies, so they deal 20% less damage against you by default, and you also gain immunity to CC. And finally, you've got a special skill, which is literally a jump, slam, flat attack that works against bosses as well. Like, very few times will bosses not get flattened by this ability, but you also apply a vulnerability debuff against them for 8 seconds, which increases all damage that they take for 8%. So the way you're going to be using this is you would typically start with the Stormbreaker Spear, get all of the taunts and the debuffs in, and make sure that you also use the heavy charge attack to get the drumbeat effect. Then immediately switch to, of course, the Mo Blade, following up with that Empowered Shield that now also increases your damage and gives you survivability, and then you can just draw everybody in with your special skill. Once everybody is flattened up, you can simply unleash a charged light attack against everybody, or a charged heavy depending how many are left, or if you don't want to miss any of those heavy hits. And you should see high damage numbers against everybody, and all of that payout will be definitely worth it. Like I said, it's one of my preferred ways of playing. It's definitely one of my favorite sets in the game, even from early on, and absolutely lovely to play with. Anyway, moving on, we've also got a healer setup via Panacea Fan and Soul Shade Umbrella, and both of these will provide very high survivability, a lot of support, but minimal DPS, and pretty much everything else will suffer. So this is mostly for supporting your party, especially in group situations, but you can also keep one of these as an offhand during the leveling stage to greatly increase survivability. Panacea Fan being one of them has been a great offhand weapon to keep myself alive without having to resort to consuming any potions and whatnot. So we're gonna start with the Panacea Fan. In terms of damage, the only attack it has is on the light attack, so that's pretty much it, and the damage will be very low. Mostly you will use it for its healing capability, starting with the heavy attack, aka the healing skill. So this is both going to heal you or any other target you target in the UI menu, and also generate dew, which is going to be the resource you consume with this for your other special skills. Which brings us to the martial arts skill. This is going to be your AoE range healing. You put down a copy on the ground at your position, and in a large circle everybody gets healed every second. You even get a perception skill if you have max dewdrops at the end of it, so that's actually going to help quite a bit. Finally, the special ability, which is called the Light Dust After Morning Rain, is just going to be a healing over time effect. However, keep in mind that this can turn into a full resurrection if somebody in the party has been downed, of course. And the same goes in the case of the martial arts. Its sense skill or ability synergizes really well with the Soul Shade Umbrella at providing a burst of healing if you don't have any of those resources consumed. So this is going to bring us to the Soul Shade Umbrella, and unlike the previous weapon, this actually has some extra DPS in it as well, both via the light and the heavy attack buttons. For the light attack, like in the case of all umbrellas, it's going to be a range of projectiles that you can hit at a target. Not really high damage, but still makes you a little bit more useful. Interesting is that the final hit in the light attack chain does a very good job at interrupting enemy attacks, even the red ones, so relatively speaking, it's pretty decent at keeping enemies far away from you. For the heavy attack, we have a couple of them. We have both the regular heavy attack, which is a series of spins into the target, or the charged one, which you can hold down by keeping the button pressed. And this is going to help with something really big. This is going to help you extend the exhaustion status on the target. So just to show you an example, if I were to get this target exhausted and then hold down the charge button against it, you will see that the exhaustion meter doesn't deplete just yet. So theoretically, you can hold off the stun duration for a lot longer, time in which your other party members may have a lot more time to hit the target and squeeze in even more DPS. So this provides a ton of support. And speaking of support, the Q ability also does that. Not only is this going to be a healing, the martial arts skill also gives you and everybody else a 15% damage increase, which is really nice. Plus, it synergizes with the Mystic Arts of the Panacea fan. It says here increases the Mystic Arts by 20%, so it helps with the healing if you have both of these at the same time. And finally, on the special skill, this is going to throw the umbrella up into the air and you're going to gain the special effect out of it, which is a healing over time, plus increases the dewdrop generation over time. So you can have this active and then switch to the Panacea fan and continue the healing there. Your healing gets empowered by 15% and you get more dewdrop generation. And after testing this, from level 1 to 60 plus, you can literally stay in the middle of entire groups of enemies and you will not perish. Unless it's a boss encounter from the main story. You get reduced healing until you finish that off, so that may not work quite as well. But I will say survivability against everything else is just off the charts with these two. Anyway, this brings us to the higher skill ceiling section of today's video, and we have a really solid one for DPS, kind of making you feeling like a demon god of sorts, with the combo between Infernal Twin Blades and Mortal Rope Dart. So if you want really high damage, really high mobility, a really cool demon effect, plus lower survivability and maybe a little bit higher skill ceiling, this may be the one for you. So in terms of our Infernal Twin Blades, this is a really solid option even from early on. Your light attacks are a series of up to 4 hits that do one thing and one thing very well, and that is building up your Blazing Wrath, aka Karmic Flame. That is going to be your unique resource that you can then activate with the heavy attack. So you don't actually have heavy attacks with this. Instead, once that red bar atop of your Infernal Blades fully fills out, you can trigger this demon mode called Blazing Wrath, during which you get increased damage, you get a bit of lifesteal, you get complete CC immunity, a bit more speed, and a lot more critical chance and critical damage. Plus, your attacks get empowered, so now they also deal a lot more posture damage, especially if you go full in with the full 5 series of new attacks that you get that end up with a ton of damage spins basically on the sword. So it feels very satisfying to pull off. Also, good to note is that if you dodge incoming attacks during this state, you can resume the combo where you left it off. However, if you parry, you have to restart it. So it's better to maybe dodge during this state so that you can continue where you left off and squeeze in the highest amount of damage that typically trigger on the final part of the combo chain. Besides this, we've got the martial arts skill called Addled Mind. This is a very good gap closer mobility tool. You can also have up to like 3 charges by default on it, and it's really great as a damage spin against the target. Those spins can be really wild and can even interrupt bosses if you use them and stack them with one another. And finally, we've got Calamity's Creed. This is just going to be another interrupt slash damage mechanic. However, it has 2 components, so if you hit the target both with the first attack and with the follow-up attack, you're going to trigger an enlightenment buff, which essentially reduces the cooldown of your martial arts skill by 3 seconds, so you can spam it a little bit more. You will want to hit targets with the second, like cross, horizontal, slash, as it helps with that, but it's also good at staggering. Like I said though, this couples really well with the Mortal Rope Dart, aka Kusarigama, I guess. It kind of functions about the same. Its light attack is a series of swings, 4 consecutive attacks that deal light, lower DPS damage, so you're not gonna like melt enemies with it and whatnot. It does have a varied combo version, so if you use the heavy attack instead, you can hold that down, spin the blade, and then you can either use the heavy or a light follow-up, depending if you want to pull the target in or just smack it and then flat it against the ground. But that takes a little bit of time, and we're gonna instead focus on the martial arts. So one of them is going to be the Blade Bound Thread. This is going to be a scorpion pull of sorts. You trigger in the target, hit it against the ground, and this is also going to provide a debuff against them so that your special attack, the other one, will deal 50% more damage and will generate your specific resource, the Token of Gratitude, much quicker. As a result, you will need that for the special ability. Speaking of which, it's called Rodent Rampage. So with this, what you do, you throw in a bunch of, I guess, rodents into the ground for about 10 seconds, and every time you deal light damage while those are active, they will emerge from the ground and also hit the target. And here is the cool thing about this: they will trigger on any light melee attack. So not just with the rope dart, you can even switch back to the infernal twin blades and do the same with the much better light attacks from that one. And before you ask, yes, it also works while in the middle of the Wrath/Demon mode. So those are melee, light melee attacks as well. They are just empowered. And in that case, you get both the benefits from the Demon mode, and you also, of course, get the rodent damage. So the more of those you get into the ground, the more they will jump into the target, hit them, get the damage, and of course, all of the staggers in. That's why this is a very cool playstyle to pick off. And like I said, the skill ceiling on it is a little bit higher, but not the highest, just a bit above average, and probably everybody should be able to get this with a bit of practice. But this finally brings us to our last combo, and in my opinion one of the most difficult to grasp out of all of them, simply because there are much more convoluted combos to pick off. But if you do manage to pull this off properly, you get some really high damage and control. So this is going to be the combo between Inkwell Fan and the Vernal Umbrella, both of which are specifically suited for high acrobatics, really good damage, a lot of enemy control and CC at the cost of somewhat lower survivability, but if you play it properly, your survivability should actually be higher. So let's get started with the fan. This has both light and charged versions for both of its types of attacks. So starting with the light attack, the regular one is just a 4 series of blows. However, if you also hold down the button, instead you're going to unleash a tornado. And if that tornado hits the target, this is going to put them up into a launch state. So what you can do from this point on is follow up with a heavy attack. And if the enemy is in the air, your character automatically tracks to it, even from very far away, prioritizing it, and then you can follow with a whole bunch of mid-air combo attacks that are really devastating against that target. And yes, it works against mini bosses as well. Besides this, we've also got a martial arts skill called the Jade Wind Shield. Like the name implies, this causes a wind from the ground to emerge. Your character does a step back, so really good at disengaging. And that whole shield provides complete immunity to any incoming ranged attacks. All of them pretty much get blocked. Even enemies get physically blocked by it. And finally, we've got the special skill, Peak's Springless Silence. This is going to be a dash forward that also roots the target in place, and you also leave behind a, well, I guess, after image that you can teleport back to if you press the button again. But if the enemy is not in a launch state, you can launch him with this ability as well, and then follow up with a heavy too. Overall, a very fun playstyle, very acrobatic and also very quick, but you do have to be careful about positioning. So this is going to become an even more important factor as you attack groups of enemies. But relatively speaking, abilities with this are pretty spammy too. They are quite heavy on the stamina consumption, so do be careful about that. Finally, we've also got the Vernal Umbrella, which of all the weapons I've noticed has the highest amount of skills and combos you can trigger, both on the light and the heavy attack. So let me just show you what I mean by that. In terms of the light attack, your regular normal light attacks are going to be the same as every umbrella, just a series of 3 attacks with some extra range on them. However, if you charge up the light attack button, your character will instead jump into the air, float around, and unleash a whole series of daggers into the target that deal damage from far away. And you also accumulate your resource called blossoms in this case. But it's very useful at dealing damage out of harm's way. Besides that, we've also got our heavy attacks. Now, heavy attacks have 3 components actually. You have the regular heavy attacks, which is essentially going to be just a series of spins around followed by a bunch of slashes, so not much to speak of here. You then also have a charged version of this. So the charged version basically lets you jump into the air, do a quick spin that deals damage below you, and if you keep it charged, you're going to pretty much empower the final attack in the chain once you're back onto the ground. So that's going to be a 360 AoE spin that hits everybody around you for some really high damage and stagger. However, this has a third component, which is going to be the varied combo. So if you do heavy light or heavy light attacks, instead you're going to follow up with these forward thrust sort of flybys, so it does have a varied combo that other weapons typically don't have that much of. That's why this also brings us to the martial arts skill. It's essentially going to be a stun, so you're going to spin around, follow up with an immobilized projectile that keeps the target in place for 3 seconds, works best against non-bosses by the way. And finally we've got the special skill. Like in the case of every other umbrella, you throw your umbrella into the air, it lingers around and it does its effect. In this case it deals damage to the target, but it also consumes those blossoms, so you do have to have them generated. But during this special skill you can switch to the other weapon if you want to and combine it with the fan, for example, while the umbrella deals damage in the background. If you also manage to put the target in an airborne state, yeah, these attacks will also cause the target to linger in the air for more, so the airborne duration gets increased, but it will consume those blossom resources, which means it won't last for too many attacks. But that pretty much concludes today's video. Do let me know in the comments which one of these combinations or other combinations you might want to create are you going to main in the full game. In the meantime, if you found this video useful, subscribing to the channel, activating that notification bell and leaving a like definitely helps me a lot. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.